자, 안녕하세요. This is a second video clip for Chapter 2, titled Conversation Analysis and Interactional Social Linguistics. Today, I'd like you to quickly go through the text to see what's in there and to have some rough sense of what the chapter is about. Okay. So in this chapter, before and after reading the chapter, I'd like you to think about these questions I posed today here. Number one, social linguistic approach intends to overcome a limitations of traditional linguistic. And their main problem was how they treat language forms. And then their problem was addressed by social linguistics. And then we saw how Gomper's research program handled the language forms and the social categories. Now, today we're going to talk about conversation analysis. They addresses the transcribed discourse in a different way. So I'd like you to identify their focus of research and then how they trace interactions in their analysis. So we're going to reanalyze this excerpt that was presented by Gomper. And then we'll analyze one more data set to learn about CA. And then later on, we have these non-native interactions that we're going to apply CA analysis to see how CA analysis is different in terms of dealing with a social categories in the data. And then later on, when you summarize the chapters, I'd like you to think about the underlying assumptions in each program. And these assumptions shapes their theoretical principles and then determine actual data analysis process. When you do this, pay attention to how social categories and real-time interactions are handled, how they determine, how they explain these relations. Okay, let's go to the text. Conversation analysis is in page 14. It begins in page 14. But I'd like to discuss this passage, the first paragraph in page 15. Here, conversation analysis addresses these problems differently, as their primary focus is placed on tracing the participant interpretive choices and methods sequentially. So there are two issues. Participants' choice, and then they trace them sequentially. What does sequential means? That's the key that we need to work out today. Later in the next sentence, the text says, this means that CA analyzes real-time interactions by tracing their turn-by-turn progressions. So, unlike Gomper's analysis, which look at the whole data as a one complete set, CA analysis traces line by line. And that is a major difference, and that is related to the issue of sequential analysis. I'm going to read on. While Gomper used transcribed discourse to identify relevant social factors and cultural categories, CA recommends treating the transcribed discourse as a record of the members' interpretive actions. So these types of transcription, we treat it as a record of what each participant is doing in the context. Rather than characterizing the talks through social categories such as gender and nationality, CA looks into the turn-by-turn progression with the assumption that each turn at talk sequentially relevant to what follows. In other words, the next turn tells us how the speaker understood the prior turn. So if you look at this data, in CA, we analyze line by line, and assumption is if you look at line 2, wife's turn, that help us understand how wife understand husband talk. And then if you see the line 3 tells us that how husband understand wife's turn, and so on and so on. So that's turn by turn progressions of talk. So in the data, if you read through this, I provided some alternative analysis about this data set when you follow this interaction line by line. So let's take a few examples. When husband says, "Do you know where today's paper is?" And then we don't know whether it's a request or it's a literally asking like where the paper is. So tell me. We don't know yet whether it's intended as a request or whether it's intended as a question. But wife says, "I'll get it for you" in line 2. So we understand that wife hears husband turn as a request. So she says, I'll go ahead and get it. But then if you look at line 3, husband said, "That's okay, just tell me where it is, I'll get it." So in line 3, husband understood how wife understood his own question in line 1. So husband is saying, I see you are trying to get me the paper, but you don't need it, I'll do it. Just tell me where it is, right? Then in line 4, wife again says, "No, I'll get it." Meaning, well, husband, you're fully intent going out to get the paper, but I'll do it for you, and so on and so on. Now here we have to notice that the approach is a little different, because in Gomper's case, he identified the problem first. He says this is a problem. The problem occurred because of their ethnic and social affiliations, the different social identities. But if you follow sequentially, we kind of get to forget about whether this is a husband, wife, American, British, and so on, because we pay attention to what they pay attention in the course of interactions. And that's the primary difference. By doing that, researchers are obliged, we are forced to examine what they are seeing in the course of interaction, how they handle the problems themselves within interactions. So let's look at the passages here. Trace this exchange sequentially, we can recognize that the husband and wife come to discover how their remarks has been understood and consequently address the misunderstanding. For this reason, their discourse has to be interpreted as something they accomplished, not just as problems that has arisen as a result of their cultural background. So this is quite important distinction. In CA, we are not obliged to find the problems and then find the solutions and find the cause of the problems. Rather, we treat all the interaction as an accomplishment, whether they cause problems, misunderstanding, or whatever, because if we follow line by line analysis, we can kind of see the process of how particular problems is initiated and responded and addressed in the course of interaction, rather than researchers, their perspective being imposed on the analysis. Okay, so for this reason, let's read on. For these reasons, their discourse has to be interpreted as something they accomplished, not just as a problem that is arisen as a result. Put differently, the participants find the significance of the given talk in reference to the exigency of the situation. So exigency meaning situation demands it, and builds their own discourse accordingly as constitutive language users. They are not cued actors who would act in particular ways because happen to be, for example, males and American. So CA argue that this husband and wife, they are not cued actors, they are not puppet, because they are affiliated a particular speech community. They know they have some understanding of norms of speaking, but they are not entirely subject to those cultural systems. Rather, they act on their own terms because they have to interpret each other in the course of interaction. So there's a slight difference in the way social cultures are handled. So if we examine their choices, then we see some different kinds of actions, like wives insisting, right? Or wives volunteering, and then also we can see husband is also insisting on going out to get the paper himself and so on. So there are a bit different kinds of actions we can recognize in this data. So in the chapters, I provide another data set to illustrate the difference between CA and interactional social linguistics and how categories are handled differently. Here, the data is taken from native, non-native categories, but that really doesn't matter if you look at the data very closely. Here, to classify the difference, let us examine one more excerpt. This is an exchange between a mom and her 5-year-old daughter and the mother's friend, C. The speaker B, the Bryn, the 5 years old, has just interrupted speaker A and C as they were conversing. So A, mom, said, Bryn, what did I tell you when adults are talking? And B said, silent, nothing. Then after a while, C says, okay, well, I was saying. So C is trying to continue the conversation that was interrupted momentarily. Now, let's think about what Gompers would have done with this data as opposed to what CA would do with this data. Gompers, like CA researchers, would recognize that reproaching is done, right? The mom is reproaching Bryn about interruption. And then he would say, Gompers would identify categories: mom, daughter, friends, adults, and then rules of speaking, like, kids are not supposed to interrupt when adults are talking and so on and so on. So Gompers would identify the problems and then use social categories to explain what happened, right? How that problem was addressed and so on. But in CA, we'll examine the sequential context first, what happens under what context. So we first note that A's comment was a response to whatever Bryn has done before. So A and C were talking, and then B says something, and A's turn in line 1 is a response to it. Bryn, what did I tell you when adults are talking? Now, I want you to recognize that there are all kinds of different ways that A could have done the same actions to Bryn. Like, A could have said, Bryn, stop it. Or, Bryn, you are interrupting. Or A could have just stared B, and then maybe B would recognize it, and so on. So when we examine this kind of actions, we have to understand that this is one out of many different ways of handling it. So that's where we start seeing the method, right? The second of all, we have to examine how A's turn is organized. And A says, Bryn, what did I tell you when others are talking? So first, A talk about what happened before. What did I tell you? Meaning, mother must have said something to Bryn before. And then B knew it, and A knew it. So they are referring to sort of history that they shared. And then second part, adults are talking. Well, A, her name is Mary, and then C, name is John, whatever. Then they could have said, Bryn, what did I tell you when Mary and John are talking? She didn't say it. She characterized this A and B as an adult. So when you say adult, then B's identity as a kid is highlighted. Then you bring out the sense of what what you should do when adults are talking as a kid, right? So you kind of bring out some responsibilities and obligations in terms of how to speak when you have an adult talking, and so on and so on. So that's a distinctive method that Gompertz program never get to. Second issue, A produced this talk, maybe a reproaching or maybe a question, who knows? But we understand that this becomes a reproach because B responds to it. If B says, Bryn, what did I tell you when others are talking? And B says, Mom, you said, and so on and so on and so on. Then B treats A's turn as a question. But here, Bryn didn't do it. Bryn just remained silent. So Bryn recognized that what A says is not a question, but as a reproach. So she responds accordingly. C also, on his part, seeing something happen between A and B and waited for a while, and then the situation is ended. So she begins his talk again with A. So each line tells us that how this participant understand the prior turn, and then they act on it. And tracing those line by line interactions, we could get to the kind of strategies and problems and issues that these people are seeing in the course of interaction, rather than researchers who purpose to know everything about this context or norms of speaking argue about what this paper is about, or what this interaction is about. So that difference is explained here in this context. And then now that we examined a husband-wife data, I don't think you'll have too much problems understanding the argument here. So let's quickly move on to the next section. Let me briefly talk about this part, this analysis, as a concluding remark. This analysis provides a very different result from real-time interaction, specifically one that comes through interactional social linguistics. Analyzing interaction sequentially treats the interaction itself as something that displays the participant choices to act, and this by way of the fact that their actions are initiated and acted on. Talking interaction itself displays the members' distinctive method of organizing their talk to produce contextually relevant results, whether they are making complaint, answering question that does not call for answer, making a reproach, or any other such social interaction. Okay? So this is the summary of what CA is about. The question of how actual communication comes to take the shape it does, therefore, is an empirical question that CA research pursues. So let's examine this passage. The question of how actual communication comes to take the shape it does, that's the goal of CA research. Rather than identifying the problems of the interactions and looking for causal relationship, meaning you are trying to identify factors that influence a particular language interaction. That's what interactional social linguistics is good at. In contrast, CA, not particularly interested in what causes what. We are interested in how participants in interactions initiate their turn and how they respond and how they act on their conversation interactions. So we are examining method used by participants. In that way, we could identify the strategies these people are deploying in interaction. So based on that understanding, I'd like you to examine non-native data in this category. I prepared I wanted to give you some analysis of it, but I think you can handle it now that we dealt with the two data set. Now, as a from a social linguistic point of view, when you deal with a non-native data, you have these non-native speakers. This category is very important. Non-native discourse. You can associate non-native discourse as a ungrammatical sentences, low proficiency, a lot of repair, pause, linguistic problems, and so on. So in CA's analysis, those categorical issues has to be put aside. Just looking at how this particular native and non-native person identify whatever issues they are underway, and then how they deal with these problems in the course of interaction. Then it'll reveal a completely different understanding of interaction. The last passage I'd like to mention is here in page 19. So based on what we have said so far, CA analysis, this means CA analysis stands in contrast to other analytic framework that looks into the discourse organization. For example, speech act theory takes the position that the matter is making sense of the propositional content that utterances contain. So we'll examine speech act in the next chapter more closely, but briefly speaking, speech act identify ideas, propositional content meaning ideas. When you try to understand other people, we have to understand the content of their informations, what they say, what they write, and so on. So, understanding in reference to definition, reference, rules of use, context, intentions, and so on. That's the conventional approach. But in CA, the present study focuses on procedural method, the participant to talk display in the course of interaction. So rather than the content, we are paying attention to the method participants deploy. So in interaction exchange, they initiate particular types of information, knowledge, contents to do particular actions. They respond to and act on them accordingly. So CA doesn't deny that there's such things in information, knowledge, and contents. But we are not looking for something that underlies this interaction. We are rather looking at the process so that we can identify types of knowledge and content that participants initiate, and how they shape the problems, how they characterize the knowledge, and how they handle the problems in the course of interaction. So the focus is a bit different because we are looking into interaction as the participants experience it, rather than researchers' understanding of it. Right. So there were two different programs we analyzed in these two video clips, and there are some basic premises, the assumptions they were quite different from each other, and I kind of had a summary of differences in assumptions and how that influenced the way they analyze the data. Okay? This is sort of rough yet brief explanations about quite complicated differences in between them. But there are some key issues that I'd like you to keep in mind. The participants' method as opposed to researchers' social conventions and social categories. And because this difference will influence the way we analyze all kinds of data, natural conversation, professional discourse, and so on and so on. So in the next class, we're going to talk about some theoretical foundations of conversational analysis, getting a little more deeper about theoretical precepts. And after that, we'll begin to do some sort of technical analysis of a lot of different data. Okay? Thank you.